Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Don sitting in I guess Alexis and I can argue whether it properly should be the left-hand side or the right-hand side.
I was going to say, you're in the driver's seat, but which side it is?
Yeah, well,
debatable.
we're based in America, so we'll be an American podcast. I will be in the left-hand side of the two-seater what-if machine. You've already heard her voice, so I'm joined today by Alexis. Haven't had a chance to record together in a while, so it's good to be here.
Yeah, it's been a while.
It's been a little bit. So today we're going to look at a topic that actually is an extension of a thing that I've been doing that's sort of an intermittent series. As I mentioned last week on the podcast, we have a lot of exciting topics with exciting guests that are sort of in the queue. It takes a while to put some of those episodes together, particularly around spring break and the holidays. So we'll be coming up to those as we get through the rest here of April, May, and into June.
As I say, we have a holiday in a couple days as we're recording, so.
Yeah, we're recording here right before Easter. Which is, of course, when this episode will go out. So what we're going to pick up today is I'd started this thing called basically it was a what if around a different 1492. So not the Columbus, using air quotes here, discovery of the New World. It was here all along. He just stumbled upon it, thinking he was trying to go somewhere else. But what would have happened had there been a delayed European discovery, rediscovery? Again, not going to relitigate the whole Viking question.
Accidental bumping into.
Yeah, whatever. Of this. And so I've been doing this in sort of multiple parts. You may recall part one really focused on how Europe would have been different, which I think is actually one of the more interesting things that may not be discussed as much because the New World brought change to the Old World. Particularly the position, as I talked about during that episode, of Spain. And how Portugal might have been different, all of that we went there. And then the second one sort of focused a little bit more on almost revisiting a past topic, which was revisiting the question of what would have happened with Central America native peoples in a different 1492 or a delayed 1492. So Alexis joining for essentially what now becomes part 3 of this intermittent, every once in a while you're going to get an episode that touches this kind of series. And we're going to focus on another Native American group. I will probably use the word Indian. I understand.
So will I, and
yes.
I'll try not to.
Yes, so just please indulge us there. Certainly when I was young in school, that was still the term that was used, although I appreciate and understand why we refer to them as Native Americans and not Indians. Columbus made the mistake of calling them Indians because he somehow thought he had landed in Asia.
Yeah.
But so looking at the Native American cultures and how they would have been different, and instead of going further south and talking about another area primarily of Spanish influence, we're going to go more to the north. We're going to go to more North America proper, particularly the areas that we think of as being the United States and Canada today. So when we come back here after the break, hope that you join us for part 3 of this alternative look at a different 1492. And we're going to visit what would have been Native American tribes in America when we come back. Hope you stay with us.
Would groceries delivered to you in as fast as 1 hour save you a trip to the store? Instacart makes that possible thanks to personal shoppers in your area who hand-select items based on your preferences from the stores you love. And shopping multiple stores is possible on a single order. Instacart picks the freshest produce and even keeps your eggs safe, all while finding everything you usually buy, providing smart suggestions for new items, and even highlighting deals to help you save money. And now you get free delivery on your first order over $35. Let Instacart know we sent you and help support our show by following the link in the show notes. Instacart. Groceries delivered in as fast as 1 hour.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Don joined today by
Alexis.
Hey, Lex. And as we talked about...
Long time no talk.
Long time no talk. Long time no talk on air, on podcast.
Yes.
As we talked about as we were leading in before the break, we're going to come back and look at part 3 of our 1492 exercise. So I'm going to ask the question. Fair disclaimer, confession they say is good for the soul. We have not spent a lot of time ahead of this recording talking about what we're going to talk about here, which I think is sometimes the magic of the podcast, where it sort of evolves on its own based upon the things that we know and that we've studied. Fair enough, Lex?
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you a question to kick off into this, to see how it's like mine but different than mine, since there's obviously an age difference, that whole generational thing. But,
The fact that you're my dad.
Yeah, exactly. There should be an appropriate age difference. Is when you were taught about the arrival of Europeans into the area that we know as America today. So really, this is the way you would have approached European settlement from the standpoint of American history. Let's just put it in that context.
Mm-hmm.
What do you remember sort of being, what were you told about how that went, how that worked, what it was about? What was the main narrative there?
Well, I'm immediately flashing back, and I'm pretty sure it was the same for you, but we had 8th grade was American history, and then 11th grade was American history for us. And I'm immediately flashing back to my 8th grade American history class, and as we kind of got to this era of exploration and kind of settlement of what eventually becomes the United States, I remember my teacher saying, Disney got it wrong.
And I think probably the reference there was to what particular thing?
That would be what was, I think, one of my favorite Disney movies growing up was Pocahontas.
Yeah. And Disney, if I recall correctly, it's been a while. I think I probably have only seen Pocahontas once.
That's funny, because I had a birthday party that was Pocahontas
Well,
themed, but okay.
Again, I watched it, I'm sure, once with you. But it's not that I don't like Disney animated musicals. Let me go on record as saying I'm not opposed to Disney animated musicals, so we don't need the hate email or the hate feedback from that. But as I recall about that, it was the traditional way that a lot of people get that story wrong. It wasn't even the right person.
Right.
It wasn't even necessarily, I guess they got the right tribes, the right area right, but traditionally that's been centered around John Smith, and it wasn't even John Smith, right? It was John Rolfe.
It was John Rolfe, and also, and we'll probably get into this a little bit, but if you've seen the movie Pocahontas, the whole thing is Pocahontas steps in and essentially takes over because John Smith is going to be sacrificed. And there's this whole discussion, I hesitate to use the word debate, but there's this whole kind of academic discussion about were they actually going to kill him, or, things like that. So customs and things like that were also not taken into consideration.
Well, to me, that's actually, along those lines, is actually what I think makes something like this difficult, because we were all sort of given this, and there's nothing wrong with this sort of high-level, abbreviated version of events.
Yeah, there is something to be said for simplifying things, especially when you're first learning something. It's like you get the broad overview, and then you can kind of drill down and get a little more granular. But yeah, I think when you do that, you miss some things.
Yeah, and so, granted, this is also a generational shift, and it's not that there hadn't been the point of reaching the criticism of European settlement and colonization of the New World by the time that I was in elementary school in the 70s and high school in the 80s, college in the late 80s and in the very early 90s. That had already happened, legitimately so. That's even changed a lot more in the last 30 years. For example, now Columbus Day,
not really a thing anymore.
No, Indigenous Peoples Day. This whole, that whole shift, sort of had its roots obviously back there, but it's come to where it is now. Don't want to chase the political aspect of that, except to say that I think a lot of our thinking about this whole question of pre-Columbian. That's actually the term that's used, before Columbus and after Columbus in the New World, and how that plays out, which is why I thought this topic would be an interesting thing just to intersperse along the way, because it's very difficult to imagine exactly how things would have been different. I don't think we would have gone 500 years with an absolute no quote-unquote discovery by Europeans of North America. So does it make a difference if it's 20, 30, 40 years later, which is part of what I wanted to explore and we've already explored. So we can set it more of the background here. So when we think of, again, I'm going to call them the American Native Americans, meaning the area that we think of as being America today.
The U.S. today.
The U.S., yeah, is they are different in many ways than, for example, the Aztecs and the Mayans were.
Right.
So again, just from what you remember from history, what are some of those differences?
So, from what I remember, the Native Americans that are, see, I'm already like mentally checking myself because I wanted to say Indians, so I apologize if I slip. But the Native Americans that are in what we think of as the U.S. and Canada today are a little more pastoral, a little more, I don't want to say not as advanced and not as civilized, but when I think of the Central American and South American tribes, it's, you have those big cities and those big kind of centers of commerce and trade and things like that, and a little more cosmopolitan almost, I guess, than up north where it's a little more, I don't want to use the word simple because simple is not right, but it's a little smaller. It's on like a smaller scale. It's smaller villages, it's smaller civilizations and things like that. Is kind of the big difference that I first kind of see between the two.
Yeah, the thing that jumps out in my mind, I think I get exactly what you're saying, and then struggle with the words on how to
describe it. Yes,
is that, for example, we call the Aztec Empire,
right?
The Mayan Empire. We know that the Maya, for example, were a collection of what grew to be, in some cases, very large city-states, and at least from my initial exposure to the U.S. portion of pre-Columbian North America, is that there was less of that. There's no Tenochtitlan. There's no
right.
There's no. I'm trying to think of some of the big Mayan. There's no Chichen Itza, except that the more that we do archaeology, we discover that there were these mound building cultures. And for example, we know, I'll use the example up in the Northeast, the Iroquois people. They had a council of in fact, that actually is pointed to sometimes by the founding fathers of the United States as being one of the models that they looked at. The Iroquois Confederation was one of the political models that they sort of considered in the formation of the Articles of Confederation and ultimately the Constitution. So to say that they weren't, again, I understand why you struggle with that. It's almost like, well, they weren't civilized. Well, they had a different type of civilization.
Right.
And
the word civilized in their sense does not fit the modern definition of what we call civilized.
Correct. And so, for example, again, and we're going to get off into the what ifs here, but again, setting the background a little bit, because we have to, this is sort of setting it against the what did, or sometimes our perception of the what did,
right,
which I think can be misleading, potentially dangerously so, is that, you use the word pastoral, these were more hunter-gatherer types,
mm-hmm.
seem to be more agricultural. Not that the Aztecs and the Mayans and ultimately the Incas were not agricultural, but I understand exactly what you're saying. The difference between, well, to borrow a fictional thing, James Fenimore Cooper's Hawkeye, in the modern movie adaptation of that. I can't even think of the name of the movie that's in. Daniel Day-Lewis played him. I can't even think of what that is now. But that portrayal of a Native American versus the portrayal of the Native Americans that Cortez and Coronado and Pizarro encountered in Central and South America, very different. They're different cultures.
Right.
And they were different cultures because of different geographies, different philosophical views, religious views, the whole thing. And so, again, the other thing that goes into here is to think of the Native Americans as one unified concept of a people is also another.
It's not correct.
Right. and again, the other thing that creeps in here is we tend to think of the level of, quote, advancement of the civilizations to be around technology. And we think of it being around the technology. I've said this before. There is no scenario when you're looking at these things that things are sort of not going to turn out completely different with European domination of the New World just because of weapons technology.
Right.
Weapons technology was not at the same place for the New World and the Old World. And that was always going to favor, at least in the short term, these new arrivals who had gunpowder, and they had cannon, they had other weapons that the Native Americans simply did not have until they managed to acquire or steal or gather in response, which they did
right
fairly quickly. And so in that sense, in my opinion, you can't change the big sweeping outcome because of just the difference in technology, but don't confuse the difference in technology for a difference in level of civilization.
Correct. Right. Exactly.
And, for example, the building capabilities of the Mayans and the Aztecs, and even the things, particularly the Incas, the things that we discover even about the tribes in the areas we're going to talk about today, which are more the U.S. parts of the New World, are capable there.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a difference, for example, between the mound building cultures in the southeast, the modern United States, and the central Mexican cultures, the Aztecs, and then the Central American cultures, the Mayas. Those are different.
Right.
And even there, the Aztecs were far superior in terms of some of that building technology, it appears, than the mound builders were, even in the same time frame.
Right.
So the story of 1492 is it's normally taught, and again, 1492 is also not the period of time when the first folks are arriving in what is now the northeast United States or along the eastern seaboard. That's actually a delayed arrival.
Right. And there were some false starts there.
Right. And so one of the things to jump in and say is that, and again, one of the questions I want to ask, this is going to be our first historical what if. What if instead of the Bahamas, the Caribbean, South America, Central America, which is the first encounters between Spanish arrivals in the New World, the English arrivals and the French arrivals, which are more in the area that we're talking about today, come after that? So the first thing I'm going to ask is, what if Columbus had ended up, just by the way the winds were blowing and the way the currents carried him and where he launched off for, what if he had landed
on the mainland?
On the mainland, and let's say further up what we think of as the U.S. coast today. So let's put him in the Carolinas or Virginia or even maybe as far north as New England. So the first what if I'm just going to ask what if Columbus had landed there instead?
Well, the first thing that immediately pops into my head, and it kind of happens in the real timeline, in the what did, is weather. I mean, in the Caribbean and the Bahamas and that kind of area, and Haiti, Dominica, where he landed, it's tropical. The problem with New England, it's cold, it's rainy, and windy, and kind of gross.
Yeah, you're definitely right. And for example, you talked about the false starts. Later, as settlers come, for example, Jamestown, as we have the other instances that happen to these lost, the Roanoke settlement, the lost settlements, is they have problems when they hit that little season called
winter. Yeah.
Being able to sustain themselves through the winter, which was not as much of a consideration in the Caribbean, South America. Different considerations there dealing with storms and the other parts of what was there, but a very different consideration in, again, those two different landing places.
Right, and I could be wrong, but in my head I equate the Caribbean a little bit more with where he was coming from in terms of weather and being similar than if he had come from where he sailed from and landed in what we know as New England in the middle colonies, essentially, the eastern seaboard. Yeah. So, yeah.
And then the other thing that jumps out to me is that if you read the accounts, and I talked about this in some of the other episodes, very quickly what they do encounter is they encounter and notice that there is this thing called gold.
Mm-hmm.
And so...
that doesn't exist on the eastern seaboard.
Not in the same way. I mean, there would have been other things of value, other artifacts, but when you go back and just look at what the Native American cultures had that was easy on display for these European arrivals to see, you would not have seen tons and tons and tons of
gold, precious metals, gems.
Right. And so, one of the questions that I immediately ask you, and now keeping this Columbus in 1492 just landing someplace different. Is that would the story of his second, third, and fourth, quote, voyages of discovery, and then the subsequent influx of the conquistadors and other explorers and colonizers from Spain, would they have been coming looking for gold, or would it have attracted a different style of exploration or a different way that it would have played itself out if we were talking about Spanish, quote-unquote, New England?
Right.
That being New Spain versus being that basically New Spain being where New England is.
Right. That's a weird concept. But I think you're right. I think if they're not immediately finding gold and kind of the easy riches that they found in the real timeline. If they're having to kind of work a little harder and maybe it takes a little bit more effort. Like the thing that's popping into my head that becomes valuable in the eastern colonies of the United States is tobacco. Well, that just doesn't spring up overnight. You've got to grow it, you've got to cultivate it, but it's very valuable and it becomes very valuable. So I'm wondering what if Spain is in charge of the tobacco trade from the New World instead of England.
Yeah. And so, again, now tying back a little bit back to part one of this series where I talked about the difference in Spain, the nature of Spain in Europe is different because of the influx of wealth from gold.
Right.
That definitely changes the trajectory of a lot of things that are happening in the old world at that particular time. Spain leaps forward because of this source of wealth that it has, and in the middle of tons of other episodes where we've talked about the political and religious conflicts that are going on, Spain, England, France, all of that at this time. But if they don't have that influx of gold because Columbus just lands in a different place. Yeah, and again, sort of already covered that on part one of this series, except to say now that that's one of the things that would be different. Now thinking back to the real what if, how would Spanish influence have been different on those Native American cultures there versus the way that they interacted with the English? I don't know the answer to that question. I pose it, but I don't know the answer to it because the Spanish culture, I agree, it was a little bit more similar climate. Yes, it was different. It was tropical climate. It's not like Spain is more desert and more that than Northern Europe is. And so it was they were a little bit more naturally in tune with that climate, even though it was different. But would that have caused a different, could you have imposed Spanish ideals or Spanish ways of doing things easily in the American Northeast?
Well, again, kind of the first thing that pops in my head, and again, see previous episodes we've talked about, you just mentioned, what's kind of going on in Europe in terms of religion. We have Spain, a very Catholic country. When England is colonizing this part of the world, they're newly Protestant. They've got tons of splinter groups. It's in some ways harder to kind of impose that religious takeover in America because they're so splintered. If Spain is coming up and colonizing what we think of as that part of America, they are very heavily Catholic and they know they're Catholic. So it'd be a very strong and very dominant Catholic influence on that area of the world.
Right. And I agree with that. And so, again, the what if here really is to talk about how it would have been different inside with the delayed thing.
Right.
So these cultures, as I understand them, that existed in what we think of now as the American Northeast, the American South, as you mentioned, these were much more agrarian-based and they were not as centralized urban
right.
in their orientation. So if you carry that forward, let's say that you have a delayed arrival either by the Spanish or an arrival by someone else during the period of time, how is that different for these Native American tribes? Do they, in your mind, do they evolve substantially different, or is it really just because there was a lack of not to say there wasn't conflict among those tribes? We have evidence of that as well, but nothing near like what apparently we see in the areas of Central and South America.
Right.
So do you think that would have been different with the delayed aspect there?
I think you would have been able to see a little bit more allying together and a little bit more cohesiveness if there had been a delay. You're right, they were not as strongly allied as the tribes that were in Central America, but you did see confederations and allies and treaties and things like that between these tribes. So I think if you have a delay of even a few decades, you have that ability for them to kind of galvanize those relationships and make those relationships a little bit stronger. So when you do have somebody coming in, they're able to kind of form a coalition and fight back a little bit more instead of being fragmented And it's kind of like, it's almost like whack-a-mole. You like defeat this, defeat that, defeat that. If you have this delay, you have this chance that they can galvanize themselves a little bit more, get a little bit more organized in terms of treaties and coalitions, so that when somebody does come in, that they can kind of push back a little bit harder.
Yeah, of course, the other thing that's there, again, there's always going to be the common themes here, because the main thing that caused the loss of Native American life is not just that superior weapons technology, but it is the diseases that the Europeans are bringing. And so, for example, this again, going back to what we talked about at the initial part of how this is sort of presented to us in its simplistic form when we're in elementary school or junior high, middle school, or then in high school, was that to the Europeans in that part, the landing, be it the Spanish then or others later, is that it appeared to be almost this virgin, almost uninhabited land. There's just land everywhere, and there's hardly anybody here.
Yeah.
And the reality that we've come to know, in fact, I'm looking over here at the book on my shelf, which actually talks about this. It's called 1491, which talks about there seems to have been a strong case to be made for there had been enough contact with Europeans indirectly in like the century or two before that these diseases had been introduced, and there had been a pretty widespread plague to some degree that had tremendously thinned these populations before the Europeans actually arrived in the real timeline. And so part of that was the Spanish, the migration up, because there were trade networks. The migration of some of these things up from the south had caused, by the time that the English and the French and the Dutch and others are landing on the eastern seaboard of the modern United States, there had already been this loss of life as a result of that same problem, the pandemic plague type of approach.
Right.
So, again, you identified them earlier as sort of being more these confederations, these groups of people, less around urban, quote-unquote, urban centers, city centers, sort of more spread out. So your suggestion would be they may coalesce into larger, more powerful...
Maybe not, what we think of as cities or things like that. It might be still a little bit more that agrarian, pastoral setup, but would have been a little bit more like, we're allied with the people in, 20 miles away, and if we find out that those people are being attacked, we're going to ride them. We're going to, not like, well, they're over there and we're over here. It would be a little more cohesive, even though it wouldn't be the same way as we would see the city centers and the kind of building up of this grand civilization. I think they would have kept their way of life. It just would have been a little more connected.
I agree with that. And then I think, again, the other thing here that it does matter who shows up on those shores.
Yeah, it does.
Because, again, and I'm not singling out any European nation, any European group here, but you point out the difference between a zealous desire to convert the Native Americans that Spain carried out. I mean, it was very much...
You're wrong. We're right. Listen to how we're going to do it.
Yeah. And there was... And again, I don't want to pass this naive thing that there were not the displacement of Native Americans by the English, by the Dutch.
There was.
That still happened. It just happened in a slightly different way than the way that it happened in Central and South America, from my perspective on that.
Right.
They were still dispossessed of their land. It was still taken from them. It was just done in a slightly different way with a slightly less... I will say that I think there was a slightly less aggressive bend to that by the English, the Dutch. Maybe the French were a little bit more aggressive in my mind, but there was less of that than what we directly saw with the conquistador mindset of the Spanish in Central and South America.
The way I see it in my head, and again, I'm coming at it from this very high level kind of thinking of it from how it was taught to me, but it's like with the English and the Dutch, it's more like, we just need to survive, and we're going to do whatever we need to survive. If you need to be kicked out of the way so we can survive, okay, that's fine. With the Spanish, and to a lesser extent with the French, it's, we're here and we're going to take over. With the English and the Dutch, it's more like, we're going to live next to you, but you're going to slowly kind of be pushed further and further away as we kind of get settled and get more greedy. and a little more comfortable with where we are now, and we're just gonna, oh, you're suddenly living 20 miles north than where you used to be because we've expanded. Whereas with the Spanish and again with the French, it's like we're here and this is ours now.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing that really strikes me, again, this becomes topography and geography too, is that when you think how far in, again, I'm spending a lot more time talking about Central and South America than I thought we would in this episode, as a contrast to
Right.
the other part, is that when you think about how far inland Tenochtitlan was, where Cortez ends up encountering the Aztecs over the space of a year, working with the other tribes, by the way, which were in opposition in many cases to the Aztecs. That's part of how a small group of Spanish won, was they had allies who were already looking for somebody to help them get rid of the Aztec domination. But that when you think about the way it played out in the real history timeline, I think this would be true even in a later history timeline, the pushing extremely far inland along the eastern seaboard took much longer. Part of that was the difference between large open spaces like you had in Central America,
right,
and dense forested woodlands and rivers and other things, where it was just tougher to push inland in any great fashion just because of the difference in the topography.
Yeah, there's this big mountain range called the Appalachians that are really hard to get over.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And so, the nature, even a couple of hundred years later, how far the push had been made. Now, part of that was because the French had come up through New Orleans and the Mississippi and had come down through the Great Lakes from their occupation up in
Canada.
Yeah. So part of it was the reason that, in this case, English settlements didn't push as far inland was because they did have to contend with those forces who were aligned in many cases with the Native American peoples. What's called the French and Indian War, which is the North American version of the 7 Years' War, as part of that. But it also had a lot to do with topography. And that topography had a lot to do with the cultures that existed there.
Right, and that's, again, at the beginning, kind of why I was struggling with what to term kind of U.S. Native Americans. I used air quotes there since this is an audio podcast. But, yeah, they were hampered by their geography and what they were having to work with. In Central America, it's much flatter and it's much more open.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are the mountainous regions are there, but it is much more open, and there was a lot more movement. And the nature of what formed, if you will, in the way that the politics and the society and the cultures were organized, the Algonquins, the Iroquois, even the mound builders, from what we understand, and that's sort of a mystery to a lot of archaeologists, really understanding exactly what those cultures were, because of, trying to understand through artifacts and not through written record, the way that we have with others. But they were much more inclined. I don't want to say they were any more peaceful, but they were much more inclined to not need to aggressively expand because of needing to find food sources and needing to find other things, which definitely was a major part of what had come to be the Central American experience long before Europeans arrived, because of population explosion, deforestation, the things that apparently go on there. Again, I think I mentioned on one of the episodes here, this idea that we have of these Mayan pyramids in the jungle. When they were actually built and when they were actually being occupied,
Wasn't jungle.
there wasn't jungle. They had stripped and used almost all the resources there. It's a very different picture than what we have today than what it would have been if you could go back in time. That is not the same for if you go to Pennsylvania or if you go to Virginia, these other places. The topography and the terrain, yes, they're somewhat more deforested now than they were then.
But it's pretty close.
It's pretty close. I think it's a lot more similar. And the population density of those Native American groups, again, recognizing what I said before about how they may have been wiped out or diminished tremendously, were not quite the same, or organized, as you pointed out, quite the same in clusters as they were in Central and South America.
Right.
So if we advance, let's say, the first encounters between those peoples 50 or 100 years, do you think it's substantially different for those folks?
I can't see it being substantially different, with the exception of, if we're advancing it by a few decades to up to a century, you have that. I'm wondering what would the cultures of these tribes be, because the one thing about Native American cultures in the U.S. and Canada is they are very distinct. And so if you have kind of that coalition that I was mentioning, do you have kind of a melding and a kind of a lessening? I'm trying to figure out a word that isn't lessening, but a melding and a changing of the culture so that we would have almost lost maybe some of the cultures that we do have, just because there would have kind of been this chance to kind of galvanize and so there would have been this kind of intermixing that would have happened, and it's almost like we wouldn't have the distinct Native American cultures that we know, because there would have been this grouping together, and there's a chance that they would have lost some of the individuality of those tribes.
Yeah. In fact, I'm looking at a map that I have up on the screen in front of me now, describing those cultures as the Eastern Woodlands cultures.
Right.
That would have been a term we could have adapted earlier and picked up on this. But they are, again, part of that was there were confederations, there was trade, there was a lot more similarity there between those cultures, such that they might have melded more of their cultural aspects together over time than they than they did.
Right, and it's a weird concept because you think like, oh, allying is a good thing and things like that, but that almost kind of can come at the expense of losing your individuality, because you've kind of gotten so used to another way of doing things, or gotten so used to, another culture, that you kind of have forgotten what your culture was.
Well, and again, this is where I think it also gets tough, because you have to sort of arbitrarily decide who it would have been. I mentioned this earlier, and again, I know I'm circling back around to it. It may feel like I'm repeating it. But the flow of the what did is Spain first, other European powers and nations following.
Right.
So the Spain first thing came as a result of Columbus sailing under the Spanish flag. In my past episode, I talked about, it's not a far stretch. The Portuguese came pretty quickly, but it's not a far stretch to believe the Portuguese might not have been the first.
Right.
Landing more maybe in the areas because of a sailor getting blown off from there, hopping around the African coast, gets blown into Brazil, to the part of, I think it was South America's Brazil today. But really, I think how it plays out for these Eastern Woodlands tribes, the Southeast tribes, those people groups, is ultimately are their encounters in this alternate timeline with, as they were for the most part, the English and the Dutch, with some French because of coming down from Canada, and the Canadian aspects of those peoples encounter that. Or is it Spain later, but a different Spain? Or is it some other, who is the European power that's showing up on your shore? And as you pointed out, even just the difference in the religious aspects of a Catholic Spain and a fairly newly Protestant England, where a lot of the settlement that came to the United States from England ultimately came as the result of
fleeing,
either some form of prosecution, Protestants persecuting Protestants, or splinter groups coming here. That was the nature of that colonization, tied with crown colonies and crown expansion 100 years later.
Right.
And so, for example, the first primary English settlement in the U.S. or in the New World, is Jamestown.
Right.
Named for
King James.
who is the King of England. So again, pushing this back, let's assuming that it's still the same players. It's England that comes to that part of the world. Well, James is in the early part of the 17th century, followed by Charles I. But then things get a little rocky.
A little bit.
In England.
Britain. Yeah, you don't get an interregnum by, things going smoothly.
Yeah. You have this little thing called the English Civil War. You have this, thing, so if you push back, again, now just using the simple pushback concept, not Columbus, maybe somebody other than Columbus, 30, 40 years later. So now you push back Jamestown. I keep having 1603, and do I have the right?
You have the right date
in my head. Good. I didn't even look that up. So I keep thinking, well, 1603 is also an interesting time, because that's when James has assumed the throne in 1603. But now we pushed the English settlement back into the period of
1607 is Jamestown.
That's correct. 16, I have 1603 in my head because that's when James assumes the throne.
Yes, 1607 is
Jamestown. I knew as I was saying it, I knew it wasn't right. But early in James's reign.
Yes.
So if you take 1607, add 40 years to it, add 50 years to it, where does it put you? It puts you smack dab in the middle of
Civil War.
the English Civil War. Would English colonization and English interaction in the New World have been the same
No.
during the English Civil War as it was under a fairly stable reign by James?
That would be a definite no. Particularly, let's go 1607. We go forward by 40 years. Let's say 40 years. So that's 1647. So we are smack dab in the interregnum at that point. And the interregnum, it's Oliver Cromwell, and he is Puritan. So he's Protestant, but he is very hardline Protestant, very strict Protestant in terms of Puritan practices. So I think if you delay that and you have Puritan England coming over to America and colonizing, it would almost be like Spain in terms of the zeal of the religion. It'd be a different religion. It'd be Protestantism, not Catholicism. But the zeal with Puritanism is much similar than Catholicism. So that would have been a much different takeover.
Yeah, I agree. Or the alternative would be, because we did have Puritans that came.
We did.
To what would become the United States, to settle in New England and other places, but they were not the majority element of the Church of England. But they were the separatists.
They were splinter groups, and they were fleeing the established religion because they were separatists.
And so again, you still end up with English on your shore,
right,
potentially in this scenario, but you end up with either a different, as you said, zeal of English or a different English. Maybe you end up now with the folks that are coming to the New World are Catholic favoring English, or there were other groups that weren't Puritans inside of the church, and so you change again. The people that are showing up are speaking English, but they're
not the same English people.
They're not the same English people. And then how that plays out in terms of, the things that were there. For example, again, the real extension of this out is if you delay it long enough, the way that the colonies, the American colonies, portray themselves in the real timeline, we've talked about this before, is very much about an air of religious liberty, an air of separation of the church and the state because of that same phenomenon going on. So if it's settled by more of a state-sponsored England scenario, and it was, Jamestown gets its name because it's a crown colony.
Right.
But where the impetus of that is different, you might have had a very different way that would have played out. Again, Cromwell Town, Cromtown, whatever that ends up being versus Jamestown is, I think, a very different type of English settlement. Or you would have seen these, again, the groups that would have been coming from England would have been different forms of, using this term broadly, religious refugees, religious dissidents that were coming over. And so the delay is not that you necessarily get a different nationality, but you get a different flavor potentially of that nationality because of the backdrop of what's going on there.
Right.
And if you also have the delay where Spain doesn't go through a period of ascendancy, again, I talked about this in part 1, so go back and listen to that, but it's the difference in the relationships between Spain and England and all of that. You don't have the Spanish Armada.
Right. No, the reason they could have Spanish Armada is because they had Spanish gold.
That's correct. And only because they had Spanish gold.
Right. And
so does that change the way that England interacts with Spain and with the rest of the continent? All of that, again, that's the trade-off there. 1492 matters because of what it did and set off in the New World, which is, we really haven't talked about that as much, which is okay, we can deviate. But it also makes changes, I think more substantial changes in the quote-unquote
Old World.
And I think that's the hard thing to play through, but again, focusing back on what we've tried to focus on here, have done a very poor job of doing, which is what goes on in the sort of eastern woodlands and the eastern seaboard of the United States. I don't see a particularly different outcome for those people groups for all the reasons we've talked about before. They were not going to invent gunpowder cannons and the other types of things that would have enabled them to fight back from any form of colonization or occupation. And the nature of their philosophy and their social structures and their culture was that they weren't going to probably do that in any organized, militant way either.
Right.
So ultimately you have, I think, the same ends for those people, just in a different timeline, but maybe with different people that are the ones that are pushing them out.
Right. And I think you would have seen, depending on, who's pushing them out, you would have seen those cultures interacting in different ways.
Yeah. And I think the other thing, we'll sort of bring this to a close, probably we'll circle back around on this topic again, obviously, at some point, is that we've assumed here Spanish or English. We
haven't talked about the Dutch, really, the French.
Or the French. And of course the Dutch are also, part of what's going on with the Dutch is their relationship with England because of what's going on inside of Protestantism, the Dutch Revolt, and everything that's happening there. But we haven't talked really about the French, who were actively involved in the real timeline, in settlement in the New World.
Yes.
And exploration in the New World.
Yeah.
And, so if you change, again, the players there, maybe, again, we tried to focus here on the Eastern Seaboard, have done a horrible job of it, but the French influence maybe is more so there. Maybe that entire seaboard is more settled by French interest than it ever is by English interest, or maybe there actually comes to be more conflict between English and French interests in the New World without the English and Spanish interests, which are constantly at loggerheads. Just finished watching most of, a couple of weekends ago, the thing about pirates.
Yep.
And, the thing that you quickly realize there is the English had authorized privateers. Why had they authorized privateers? What had those privateers been authorized to do?
Harry some ships.
Yeah.
That were Spanish.
That were Spanish and that were carrying gold. And then when there's a change and they're no longer being authorized by the English crown, these people, the pirates, are these people who were doing something that was legitimate before under letters of marque, that suddenly they're now the outlaws, and eventually that comes back when they give them amnesty, and that's actually what this thing gets back to, and all the things that are there. But the whole point of me bringing that up is that was England, Spain.
Yep.
There wasn't all this discussion about how the
France.
French were really playing into that, although Jean Lafitte, has that French heritage of being a pirate there. But again, if you don't have Spain discovering the New World in 1492
and becoming rich off of the New World,
and being the ones that where that gold is, the gold has been moving on Spanish ships. If you don't have that, somebody's still coming for that gold eventually. Who is it?
Right. And as soon as you mention France, in my head I'm going, and we've talked about again, see previous numerous episodes of the show, this long standing animosity between France and England. This just becomes a new theater for that to play out on.
Right.
If they're both there at the same time, but in the real timeline they're not.
Right. So again, the point of this whole exercise, which we've either done very well or very poorly or some combination thereof, is if you think of the exploration, this is what the image that I have in my head making movements here you can't see. If you think of the exploration period as like a timeline slider, where you can slide by a decade or two one way or the other, I think you do change the mix of who's coming, where they're coming to, why they're coming, and once you start interacting between the New World and the Old World, you've started things that do make major differences. Again, if Spain never requires Spanish gold coming from the New World, it's a very different, in my mind, trajectory of European history for well over a century.
Mm-hmm.
If you make that change. And so that's an important thing. And again, so that's why if you suddenly don't have Columbus sailing for Spain in 1492 successfully, you do alter a lot of things. And you may end up rippling that into what happens in what we think of today as upstate New York among the Iroquois before it's all said and done.
Right.
All right. So we're going to close out the discussion here. I have a feeling we're going to come back and circle back around to this because we didn't even get further west in the Americas to talk about the Plains culture.
Yeah, I have the Cherokee in my head this whole time. We didn't even touch on them.
And the Cherokee, interesting thing there, the Cherokee are based in the south, we think it was modern southeast United States until they are relocated, obviously. But then you have, tribes like the Comanche and the Arapaho, some of these Central Plains Indians, who their entire culture is changed by the arrival of the horse, which comes as a result of the Spanish arrivals. So again, how does that play out in a different timeline as well? All right, so we're going to close out.
We got hampered in by the Appalachians. That's what was happening.
Yeah, we could not get over the Appalachians. That's an excellent point. So once again, we thank you for joining us here on A Fork in Time today. Alexis and I both thank you for that. One of the things we do want to emphasize, we sort of touch on this indirectly, but I'm going to put a little bit more of a direct emphasis here, is if you do enjoy the show, contribute to the show. We have our Patreon page. We give some special perks to some of our patrons there. But we don't ask you for a lot. And again, as we've said before, we definitely did not get into the podcasting business to get rich, because if we did, we made a horrible, horrible mistake, because we don't have a podcast about shows on TV or about Star Wars or about something else that drives massive, large audiences. We know we have a little niche audience here because of what we talk about. But I invite you to visit the website, and there you'll find the link to our Patreon page. And $1 a month, a couple of dollars a month, does help defray the costs and some of the other things that are involved in hosting the podcast, and we would definitely appreciate that. If you can't do that, though, we still appreciate the fact that you're a listener and ask you to support the show by social media and the other things that are there. One of the things that I've done in the last couple of weeks, Alexis, is I've sort of revamped a little bit of our Facebook presence.
Yeah, I've seen that.
Yeah, and I'd like to emphasize a little bit more. We reference our Facebook page. I'd like to emphasize the fact that we also have a Facebook group. And one of the things I'd really hoped would happen when we first founded the podcast, now almost 2 years ago, we're coming up on that really quick, was that we would actually have...
Last year really messed with my concept of time.
It's almost like there wasn't a year there, right? Is that, I really hope that, for example, in an episode like this, you may disagree so completely with some of the things that we've said here. You're itching to say, if you were here, you would have said something. Go to our Facebook page, go to our Facebook group, and post there. Normally, for each episode, we do post a link there, so you can put comments that are directly tied to the episode very easily on either the page or the group. One of the things I'd love to see the group become is a little bit more of a place for discussion to go back and forth, giving feedback on the episodes, what we got quote-unquote right, what we got quote-unquote wrong.
And it might lead to another episode. We might go talk about something else that you bring up.
Exactly, and that has been one of the things that has led to topical suggestions as well. So I just want to encourage that a little bit more. The other thing that's new here in the last couple of weeks, so if you go to the website, you'll now find that I went ahead and created an Instagram.
I saw that too.
So now there's an Instagram link there, and we'll be posting things about the show there. So just again, more of those opportunities to share via social media if you're willing to. That would be greatly appreciated and enjoyed there. Anything else you want to say, Lex?
This was fun. You know this, so I'll share this with our audience. I've gone through a few changes. I've changed jobs and I'm moving, so that's why you haven't heard me a lot on the podcast. I got a lot of stuff going on in the background in the quote. I don't want to say quote unquote real life, because this is real life too. But I got a bunch of stuff going on. But I'm excited to get settled again and kind of get back into the podcast group because I missed it for sure. So.
Okay, good. And I'm glad to have you back, and certainly I know what's going on there as well. So it's been an interesting past year plus. So we appreciate the fact that we've grown our audience during this period of time.
I'm really serious. Like, the sense of time is very distorted right now for me.
Yeah, I completely agree. So we're going to close out the episode here now. Again, really excited about some of the things I know that are in the works, some of the guests that we've already been talking to, and the episodes that are being generated sort of even as we speak, that are sort of in production now. So over the next couple of months, I think you're going to see some really exciting things. And again, the other thing you can do on the website, give us feedback. Just on the website, there's regular feedback opportunities there as well. So we're going to close out today's episode the way we normally close that episode, particularly when we are together, by suggesting that if folks find a fork in time, Lex, what's a good idea?
Take it.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more about the podcast at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Join us next time.